It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Robert Maginnis, and we're going to be talking about his new book, Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism. I enjoyed the conversation that Bob and I had last year, and I'm eager to have him back on the show because we are in more trying and difficult times than we were even a year ago when we last spoke. So, Bob, welcome back to the show. It's great to see you again.
No, it's great seeing you, Shaun. Thanks for having me.
And, we're going to get to the book, but we'd be doing a disservice to the viewers and the listeners if we didn't go after the topic that is really, I think, at the forefront of everybody's mind. We're recording this interview at the end of August. Afghanistan is just everywhere in the news and in the media. I just love to get your perspective on Afghanistan. What went wrong? Where is this going? I know you've been talking about that a lot recently.
Yeah, I have, Shaun, on a host of media outlets. Back in 2001, I was the vice president for the Family Research Council. On that morning of 9/11, the attack took place. The streets of Washington where I was were filled, and I could see the smoke at the Pentagon. And of course, 20 years ago, I returned to the Pentagon and know well that facility. And of course, the activities that we engaged in immediately following the attack on 9/11. I was very much in favor of going after Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. And people will recall the special operation forces mounted on horses chasing the Taliban out of Kabul and elsewhere across that country. And eventually, we did take down Osama bin Laden, who was hiding in northern Pakistan. And I think we accomplished a great deal. However, over the last 18 years, I've favored, like many Americans, not doing nation building, but withdrawing from Afghanistan, albeit leaving sufficient forces there to conduct counterterrorism, intelligence gathering, and the like. Now, fast forward to what's happened over the last few months. Months ago, in April of 2021, I did a number of interviews, mostly with overseas outlets, regarding Mr. Biden's decision to extricate all U.S. forces from Afghanistan by basically 9/11. And I suppose that date was chosen for a reason, perhaps a political reason. Of course, that sent a cold chill up the spines of most of those that had aligned themselves with Americans, and of course, many Americans themselves with blue passports living in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the administration did not take necessary measures at that point to begin to radically downsize the number of Americans and Afghans that were aligned with America that would ultimately be in danger from either the Taliban, Al Qaeda, ISIS-K, and some of the other radicals that would eventually fill the streets of Kabul and that entire Texas-sized country. Now fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, when we began to realize that Mr. Biden intended to get out of Afghanistan, not at 9/11, but rather the 31st of August. That really created a significant uproar inside Afghanistan. And of course, we at that point had already drawn down most of our forces to include surrendering Baghdad, Bagram Air Force Base outside of Kabul that has 3 active runways. And all we ended up with using, as most people realize, is Karzai International, which has a single runway and not a big ramp for putting planes that were loading and getting ready to depart or arrive. And so as a result, we ended up with basically a cordon around that airport surrounded by Taliban that were vetting people coming and going. And a couple of days ago, from my perspective, the CIA Director Burns was over there talking to Taliban, and apparently, when Mr. Biden went in and spoke with his G7 counterparts, our key allies around the world, he argued that we have to get out of Afghanistan by the 31st, and that there wasn't any negotiating on that. And of course, that led to even more angst amongst those that were still trapped there. So what I suspect will happen ultimately is that we will leave people behind, that Taliban will return with a vengeance, that there will be a civil war. We've already seen in the northern part of Afghanistan an assembling of those that are pro the former government that has crumbled under the former president, and now that are really reemerging as the former Northern Alliance that we allied ourselves with in 2001. So you have a host of issues there. Unfortunately, the Chinese, Russians, Pakistanis, Iranians are all taking advantage of this. We've lost major prestige around the world. And this was not only a political faux pas, but a political disaster, one that was totally preventable. Even though I don't believe in nation building, I do believe in executing a withdrawal that makes sense and that saves American and allied lives. And Mr. Biden has radically failed there. And I've called publicly for his impeachment. But of course, given that you have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, I doubt that anyone on his side of the political spectrum is going to support such a move.
Well, Bob, I appreciate you giving us your perspective just based on your many years of wisdom and insight of serving our country. Thank you so much for that. And to the listeners and viewers, I just challenge you to keep praying for a resolution, praying for a path forward, praying for the people of Afghanistan. As Bob said, this is a very complicated situation, and it's not going to be resolved anytime soon. I think we're going to see a lot more difficulty on the horizon for not only the coming weeks and months, but probably many years ahead. Bob, let's transition now into your new book. I think one of the interesting things of 2020, the political cycle, the election cycle, is I almost felt like people were showing their hands or, came out wearing a badge of, I'm this kind of an ism. Like, I feel like people were just like putting their stuff out there like we'd never seen before publicly in the news and the media. It was always, I feel like it was always kind of covert or, not exactly identifiable sometimes, but here it was just out there. So in terms of the many isms that we saw loud and proud on display last year, talk to us a little bit about those bad ideas, if you will, and what are some of the impacts that we've seen on culture as we've moved ahead in 2021?
Yes, Shaun, the years ago, and I think this is important to why I wrote the book. Of course, I, fought on the Korean Peninsula on the demilitarized zone and saw North Korea a bit, the unsavory side. I've been to China. I've seen the unsavory side, especially during the Cultural Revolution of 68 to 74. I had been in the Soviet Union and saw the dismal failure of that ideology, communism, played out on that entire country. My own stepmother, fled communist Czechoslovakia, and I had conversations with her about that. And of course, I spent years on the Iron Curtain and looked at eye to eye with, former East Germans and communists from the Soviet Union. And I've been to Cuba, been all over the world dealing with, these isms, whether they be communism, Marxism, socialism, and the like. They're failed ideologies. And I go into Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism, kind of profiling what they are and how they came to this country. Most Americans have no appreciation for not only the relationship between progressivism, socialism, communism, and Marxism, but they don't know the history. I wrote in a book a couple of years ago, Progressive Evil, and kind of laid out the timeline and the development of progressive thought in the United States, and really how that was counter to our constitutional principles, the foundation of this country, and how radically it was going in a very different direction. I think of John Dewey as a leading progressive in the 30s who radically transformed the education establishment in this country. And that's why the education establishment, even today, is taken captive by progressives and socialists, arguably some communists, because of what they started years ago. And that wasn't a mistake. It's interesting that John Dewey went directly in 1935-36 into Frankfurt, Germany, under the Nazi regime. And he helped a host of Marxists that were there at a Goethe Institute to infiltrate or actually immigrate out of that country, out of the Nazi regime, back to the United States. Now, that's significant. These people were all PhDs. They were all Marxists. They were all Jews. And where did John Dewey, with the Ford Foundation money, put these people? He put them in teaching colleges, teaching universities, Hollywood, and the mainstream media. And they came, and I have throughout the book, many explanations as to what they said was their intent when they came to America. And of course, they had every intention of radically transforming America into something more aligned to their own ideology, which was Marxist. Now, arguably, a lot of people don't understand the history of Marxism. Karl Marx, of course, a German, a man that has a long trail of writings, Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, and many, many others. His associations with the, kind of the remnants of the French Revolution, where arguably communism began, and it morphed and it transferred itself to London. And of course, it's from there that Marx began to have influence. That influence, which left the 19th century, came to the 20th century, and really morphed into something that we saw in the Russian Revolution of 1917 with Vladimir Lenin and his followers. So these issues, though arguably are complex, they're very important for us to understand. Years ago, I took a course in anthropology as well as sociology, and understood the manifestations of ideologies within cultures and how things transform. And we've seen a gradual transformation of some of the key institutions of the United States. And I go into this topic in Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism, not only talking about education, but talking about mainstream media and how it's been taken captive. And then I outline kind of the I suppose, the realization of what I consider the American Cultural Revolution, which is taking place today. And there are a number of proponents of that. I outline 8 in particular, and not surprising to your audience, those particular instigators include the Democratic Party and how they were infiltrated years ago and have been used accordingly to advocate for what I consider true Marxism. And the evidence that is in that particular chapter is overwhelming. And I don't think anybody could read that and not come away believing that I'm correct on that assessment. The same thing with the infiltration of communist China. Even though Richard Nixon opened the gate to communist China's participation in the world through a variety of international institutions, what it's become today is quite different than what we thought it would become. And it's truly an advocate for taking over the world and using the ideology that Marx promulgated centuries ago to really empower President Xi Jinping of China to become a world leader. And so, yes, there are prophetic issues involved here, and I have an entire chapter that goes into that, and a host of other things. I think the 500-word book not only comprehensively addresses some of this, but really wraps it up and shows how the transformation of the world as we know it, in the eyes of those proposing to transform it into a one world government under a Marxist-like regime, is pretty compelling. I hope I'm wrong, quite frankly, but I see plenty of evidence to suggest otherwise.
Bob, I'd love to have you speak a little bit more to some of the coverage you give in the book to Marxist inspired media, if you will. I think that was one of the very fascinating things to watch as somebody who works in publishing and broadcasting. I'm a professional communicator. It's how I make a living. With what we've seen throughout traditional media, social media, it almost felt like we fell into some alternate universe where we now had a state run media here in the United States. And not to say that there wasn't those sorts of influences, again, maybe more covert or under the surface before. But again, it's like, any pretense of hiding it just fell away in the last 12 to 18 months. I would love a little bit more of your perspective on that.
Yeah, Sean. Yeah, I too have been involved in this uh, in the national media for decades, and my concern has always been that behind the veil that has been ripped away here in the last year plus have been radical influences. Now, of course, journalism as a profession, I think, has uh, thrown away its credibility over the last, arguably decades, but especially here in the last couple of years. And if you go into journalism, colleges, universities, where there are courses and the like, you'll find mostly leftist materials that are employed by journalism professors and the like. And I detail a lot of that. There have been some great studies, even by conservatives, that have delineated exactly what it is they're teaching and how they ignore the very principles and values of the founding of this country. If you go back to the 1917 revolution of Russia, the first thing that Lenin did is to take over the national media and use it as a propaganda platform for his Marxist ideology. And we've seen a similar approach used in the taking of Eastern Europe post World War II. We saw it in Venezuela, certainly in Cuba, and of course today in Communist China. The Communist China, of course, very contemporary in what it does in controlling media. There's nothing like freedom of press in Communist China. Everything is vetted. Now, when it comes to our media and the influence by the Communist Chinese, I think a lot of Americans are surprised that Communist China owns a lot of media outlets, or certainly leverages a lot of media outlets. Most of Hollywood's major film makers are radically influenced by the Communist Chinese, in that if you have a marketplace, arguably of 1.4 billion people, and you want a movie made in Hollywood to show in Communist China, well, then you're totally at the mercy of the propaganda vetters in Beijing who insist that there won't be any criticism of Communist China. And in fact, you have to favorably promote their ideological views in your particular movie, or you won't be able to show it. And so the incentive for these movie houses in Hollywood has really, over the last 20 years, come full circle. They today will not make anything that's critical. Not only do they edit up front the scripts, but they review the entire movie at the end, and they insist upon certain edits if there's even a insinuation that something radically is wrong with Communist China. Now, of course, we've become rather complacent in that regard. Now, that's just the film industry. The news industry is much the same, whether it's the New York Times, who has board members that are radically in the pocket of Communist China. We've had for decades and decades. In fact, you'll recall I write in Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism about the communist, hearings and the influence that they had, not only after World War I, but especially around the time of World War II and thereafter. And of course, some of those hearings in the House of Representatives, some in the Senate, mostly in the House, considered the communist influence in Hollywood and how, they wouldn't even criticize the Soviet Union. It's interesting that initially there were arguably hundreds of communists, card-carrying communists that were inside Hollywood during the World War II period. And of course, they were initially making films and influencing films and selecting actors who could or could not speak against the communists. Initially, they spoke against the Nazis, and they didn't speak against the Nazis. Then they spoke against the Nazis. So it was back and forth as the political winds of World War II switched. As you will recall, in June of 1942, after the deal was made in late summer of 1941 between the Nazis and the communist Russians, that they would collaborate. Well, the Nazis in June of 42 attacked the communists. And so all of a sudden in Hollywood, you had the communists who had been favoring the Nazis all of a sudden become anti-Nazi, and the film industry reacted accordingly. And so did the print press. And we had a lot of communists in the print press. And of course, even under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we had a host of communists inside government, inside the State Department, inside various of the ministries, the departments of the federal government. Arguably, there were thousands. But that wasn't a mistake. That was by design. And unfortunately, even Mr. Roosevelt denied much of what has become pretty evident years later. And of course, that had ramifications for the Jewish immigration out of Nazi Germany, which was halted and really turned around in part because of the communist Nazi influence inside the federal government at the time. And I've written about this in the past. It's classically embarrassing, but these sorts of things happen in the old deeper state. And I would argue, as I began talking about Afghanistan, it happens even today in deep state Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you for that perspective, Bob. I greatly appreciate it. And, I would say, just as a response to that, if there are additional, maybe more uh, alternative media sources, if you will. Obviously, I'm a big fan of the folks at Skywatch TV and Defender Publishing. And so, if there are other news sources that you go to besides just the mainstream media, be sure to show your support, like, subscribe, share, all the things to help get the word out about other programs. It's really important to do that, especially in this increasing age of just censorship. And even it can be a real challenge to get content and messaging out there at times. So do your part to keep the sources that you trust and that you love going and moving ahead with the content that you value. Bob, next I'd love to have you speak to a looming Great Reset. We've heard a lot of chatter about this in the past year, 2 years, before that as well. But really, the pace seems to be picking up. What would a Marxist Great Reset mean here in America in terms of civil liberties, our core institutions? I guess on the one hand, for the person who's like, well, Great Reset, I don't know what that is. I guess explain that. And what would the implications of that be for us here in the States?
Well, the Great Reset, of course, some people trace it to the World Economic Forum in Davos and, some very particular people. I really see this more as a globalist takeover, and which would lead to one world government under an elitist cadre of billionaires who tend to think that they know better than the rest of us how to guide this world in a new direction. So the Great Reset, if you look at Trudeau of Canada or Biden here in the United States, you look at the George Soroses of the world, and of course, President Xi, you can name a host of billionaires and key leaders, kind of the Bilderberger people that go to the annual conference there that's hosted by the Bilderbergers, the movers and shakers of the world, who, as I wrote in The Deeper State a few years ago, my book on globalism, really want to see one economy, one world government. They want to, put everything under their guiding hand, under their so-called wisdom, and direct how things ought to work. Now, prophetically, of course, one world government appears to be an end time outcome. I can only say I believe that that's likely what is evolving here. But certainly the globalists like to dictate to us what we ought and should, what we ought to do. We've seen COVID-19 as really a globalist agenda item, and it's ultimately, I'd argue, about control. It's not about truly good medicine, and of course, some people may take issue with that, but I believe that it's being used as an opportunity to wrestle control over vast majorities of the world and put it under the thumb of some of the elite, whether they be the people that run the large corporations or certainly some of the mega media, the social networks, some of these transnational organizations. I go into how this evolves and what the strategies are, especially for the hegemonic Chinese. Keep in mind, President Xi of China has been saying, they want to be the global superpower, not only economically, but militarily. And they're going to take advantages of a variety of mechanisms, strategies that they put in place. Now, we've seen evidence of that already. We've seen Belt and Road Initiative, which reaches 140 nations around the world, where the Chinese go in and they, in exchange for infrastructure investment, they leverage political control over the population. And there are many nations. I think of Pakistan, Sri Lanka. I think of a number of many African countries, certainly many Asian countries, even South American countries, Central American countries, and a few places in Europe already have surrendered some of their sovereign rights to the Communist Chinese in exchange for infrastructure money. And so that's Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, that serves their economic globalist agenda. Militarily, I've been tracking Communist China for more than 40 years. And over the last 20, the Pentagon's been publishing an annual report on kind of the situation with the Communist Chinese military. That was mandated, by the way, by Congress. And, even though it's unclassified, it's pretty revealing. It demonstrates that, especially in recent years, the Communist Chinese military is not only the largest in terms of manpower, but sophistication. They've stolen most of our high-tech, technology for the purpose of building the most sophisticated weapons. They're doing very well in space. They intend to have a space station on the moon. They've got a space station as we speak that's circling the Earth, much like the Soyuz that we joined the Russians with and have for many years. They're looking at Mars. They're looking at space weapons, which they already have and they've tested. Look at cyber. They have an entire army that uses its cyber capabilities not only to steal us blind, but to go after individual bank accounts and go after corporations and the like. Arguably, they're worse than even the Russians, and we've had significant problems with the Russians in the cyber domain. You look at what they're doing to us in South China Sea. They've expanded their military virtually through embassies around the world. Wherever they build a port for a nation, they also have, as a second possibility, the backup of a military installation. Their Navy is the largest in the world. They're building hundreds of silos in Western China for intercontinental ballistic missiles. Arguably, of course, they say that they don't aspire to be a nuclear power on the level of the United States and Russia. I don't believe that, and there's evidence to suggest otherwise. Look at, in the coming years, I think as a direct outcome of what we failed to do in Afghanistan, I do believe that Taiwan will be invaded. They have built up, the Chinese, a amphibious capability, which they previously 5 years ago did not have. They have, placed hundreds, if not thousands, of rockets on the eastern shore facing Taiwan. They have been routinely for the last year flying large squadrons of fighters and bombers around Taiwan. Will they take Taiwan much as they took Hong Kong, but probably with force? Will they go elsewhere? I would say if I were in Japan, I'd be very concerned. They have a history with China that dates back to pre-World War II, and the Chinese have long memories, and it won't be good for the Japanese. They have ambitions for South Korea. They have ambitions for Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, the Philippines. And of course, now that they have influence inside Afghanistan, they already have a good relationship with Pakistan and the stands. And I wrote a book in 2018, Alliance of Evil, which shows their growing closeness with the Soviets, or the former Soviets, the Russians, and especially Vladimir Putin. So, the implications are broad. I know we started talking about the whole idea of a Great Reset. The Great Reset really is the host for global takeover arguably by the Chinese economically, militarily, through cyber, through space control, and through other mechanisms. I think they're making considerable progress, and the only way to stop it is to push back. And unfortunately, most of the West is too weak. And the United States was the primary stalwart against this. And under Mr. Biden, we are perceived, and I think rightly so, as a weakening superpower that could, in the near future, be taken over.
Well, Bob, on that kind of dire note, I got an important question to ask. In terms of believers right now, people are struggling to figure out how to process, on the one hand, the times we're in. So I guess I'll ask this question on two fronts. As Christians, how do we make sense of the times we're walking through right now? And what does it look like for the Christian operating in what could be a post-Great Reset world on the horizon?
Well, as you know, Shaun, I have a chapter that deals with that very issue. I go through not only the secular, common sense preparation things that we ought to do. We ought to be engaged in our government. We ought to express ourselves to our elected leaders. And I do that. As an example, I've probably written more than 20 letters to my 2 U.S. senators on very specific issues just this calendar year. I communicate with local leaders as well. And I express my concern, about local schools, about taxes, about their political agenda on transgender issues and the like. So I think we need to be engaged. We cannot sit back on our laurels and depend upon others to do that which we're called to do. I would prepare myself physically, try to stay well, and try to make sure that we have, a good associations with a community of people that we respect and love. I call that the church in most cases. And then, of course, I go into a host of other issues. I do believe, because we have a Second Amendment, I believe in being armed, and I believe in being able to use that weapon effectively. And of course, it helped that I spent decades in uniform, and they trained me, but you have to maintain that capability. Then I go into, okay, let's say we were toppled, and that we become citizens of certainly a Marxist or a socialist leaning country. what do we do? Well, I think there are a number of scriptural messages in there. I always go back and think of how Daniel lived in Babylon after the exile of 586 BC. And Daniel, of course, was always faithful to God. He prayed all the time, in spite of persecution and so forth. He was obedient as long as it didn't disagree with what God had told him to do. And so living like Daniel in a fallen world, much less in a Marxist socialist world, is something that I think the believer must be prepared to do. And I provide a number of other examples. I think in spite of the proclivity in the culture not to tell the truth, I think we Christians must tell the truth. And sometimes telling the truth has consequences. Consequences for us individually and for our families and for our community. And yet, I think to be faithful to Christ, that's what we're called to do. So I have an entire chapter. And then, of course, I deal with some of the prophetic implications. I made an argument recently, Shaun, that I know my friend who recently went to be with the Lord, Jimmy DeYoung. Jimmy always talked about the Chinese role and what he saw in the end times. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but I can make the argument, as I've in moments ago did, that the Chinese could well control everything from their shores in the Western Pacific through Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Stans, Iran, Iraq, Syria, arguably even Saudi Arabia, through Lebanon to the Mediterranean. And of course, they have great influence in Egypt, and they have great influence throughout Northern Africa and Eastern Africa, and then a growing influence in places like Greece, Italy, Spain, and even Belgium, and so forth. So you see the possibility of a hegemonic China using the tools that it has developed by design and their announced 2049 goal of being the world's dominant power militarily, economically, and otherwise. You could see that there could be a massive army. I don't know if it's true, but a massive army that comes against the tiny nation of Israel in the northern area, what I call the Valley of Megiddo or Armageddon.
Well, Bob, you've certainly given us much great food for thought. The book is widely available from our friends at Defender Publishing and Skywatch TV. You can get it there. You can pick it up wherever great Christian books are sold. Sadly, it's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Robert Maginnis. Once again, our book today was Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism. And Robert, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's an honor. It's a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Well, thank you very much, Shaun. My pleasure as well.